Mr. Chairman, honoured guests, thank you very much for that most generous welcome. I don't fully believe it, of course, but I'm flattered. I think of the time I went into a junk shop in central New South Wales and saw a book I'd written on the floor. The owner came over and said, rather aggressively, I thought, "Is there anything you'd like amongst that junk?" I didn't let on that I was the author. I picked it up and I thought the book was worth $10, and since I'd written it, I'd like to rescue it. I said I'd like to buy this book. She turned it over and found in her own penciled hand inside the cover $2. She said, $2 for a book by Geoffrey Blainey? It can't be worth that, you can have it for $1. So you've made my day. Yeah. I understand there are two audiences here tonight. One of people who are heavily involved in the mining industry and have been so involved for much of their life. There are also large numbers of people who are interested in the mining industry and would like to learn more. Realising the mix, I've modified my speech, and I hope it says something of interest to both groups. I must begin with something that still surprises me. Occasionally people come to me, journalists or historians, and ask me for some background on the mining industry, and recently I said to a journalist or historian who was very critical of the mining industry, I said large numbers of people are fascinated by it and in a sense really love it. They said that can't be true, but it is true. I remember my father telling me he was brought up at California Gully, Eaglehawk, Bendigo, in the last rich phase of the Bendigo field before the First World War. And he said in his backyard and in the backyard of many of his schoolmates, they had little mines, and they were the managers. And the mine might only be a metre deep, and it might have a makeshift head frame, but they were in charge of it. I remember going to Mount Lyell, I think in the mid-1990s, when an engine company was about to take it over, and there was a ceremony in a marquee. There you have to have a marquee for an outdoor ceremony, and because of the rain. And I think the Premier of New South Wales, Tasmania, Mr. Groom, the former Melbourne footballer, gave a speech, and there was quite a pause before the next speaker came on, and there were some children playing outside the marquee. They'd come with their parents, and suddenly a small voice piped up, "I've found copper." And others chanted, "He's found copper." It was wonderful to think that people in that town, in struggling, that town was, found there was something in their heritage that they were proud of. Just one other thing about mining. The people don't realise, who are new to mining, the enormous changes that take place. And many of those changes haven't reached, I suppose, 90% of the population. The gold rushes of the 1850s were a remarkable occasion, and it's the only time in our history that we've really shaped the world's economy. I think when Britain was #1 exporter in the world, 15% of its exports in 1 year in the 1850s went to Australia because there was so much purchasing power in the gold fields. And it always staggers me that we now produce, and this is not a record year, and Dr. Close told me tonight the exact figure, we now produce 3 times as much gold a year as was produced in the best years of the astonishing rushes of the 1850s. We now produce, and this is not the best year, 3 times as much gold annually as was produced in the best years of the 1850s rushes. I wonder if 2% of the Australian population know that remarkable fact. It must have been remarkable to live in Melbourne in the early 1850s especially when the first ships arrived from Britain with people who'd heard of the new gold discoveries and wanted to take part in them. And I've read accounts of the ships, sailing ships, reaching Port Phillip Heads and coming through the heads, and everybody looking over the side of the ship as a quarantine officer and a customs officer came aboard. And everyone was shouting out, "Is there any gold left? Is there any gold left?" They'd left England 3 or 4 months ago, and the last news they had was that rich gold was still being dug. But on the voyage out, they had this terrible fear: what if the gold is all dug before we arrive? But of course it wasn't. And they landed at Port Melbourne and came up to the city in the grip of terrible inflation, prepared themselves to go to the goldfields. And we're only 5 minutes' walk from where they set out, up Elizabeth Street. And when they had gone up Elizabeth Street to where the big flag stands in the grass in the centre of the road, they made one of their first decisions. Do we go down the Sydney Road to Beechworth, or do we go down Mount Alexander Road to Castlemaine and Bendigo, or perhaps even turn off to Ballarat? And that decision, of course, determined so much of their life. Some made the right decision and became rich and ceased to be Australians. We, of course, are the descendants of the failures. And some, of course, went into a shallow shaft, and the shaft collapsed, and that was the end of them. But I can never go down Elizabeth Street and think of the lives that were shaped by those people, finding their land legs for the first time after 3 or 4 months at sea and walking resolutely with heavy loads towards the goldfields. Of course, mining has had profound influence on this country. Again and again, it has lifted a colony or the nation out of a depression and set it on its new path. As South Australia was sick in the 1840s when the first copper was discovered at Kapunda and Burra, just north of Adelaide, and they lifted South Australia out of depression. In early 1851, the economy in Sydney and Melbourne wasn't too hot because so many people were leaving for the Californian gold rushes. It's terrible in a new country when briefly more people are leaving than arriving. And in the 1860s, when Queensland was almost destitute, gold was found at Gympie. In those days, Gympie was everything and the Sunshine Coast nearby was nothing. And that put Queensland on the map. And in Tasmania, in the early 1870s, Tasmania in economic trouble, and they found the great tin mine, at first the richest in the world, at Mount Bischoff on the northwest coast, and then the gold at Beaconsfield in the news only 4 or 6 years ago. And so it went on. South Australia depressed in the 1880s, and they found Broken Hill, which of course was populated largely by South Australians. And then Western Australia in the 1890s, in a very humble position, with far fewer people than Tasmania, and gold was found in many places close to the Indian Ocean, and West Australia suddenly soared as a colony. Incidentally, Kalgoorlie, I suppose in total tally our richest goldfield, was found 1 month after the banks crashed, that terrible event in Melbourne in 1893. What a saviour Western Australia was to so many families in the city and in rural Victoria and in South Australia too. And again, mining is revived, and the revival of mining that became so visible in the 1950s and was in towering form at the time of the global financial crisis, that had astonishing effects on Australia. And it's remarkable today how many people who didn't realise that mining was important now do realise how important it is again in Australia. So the industry has had effects on so many facets of Australian life. I thought a few years ago of the Prime Ministers since 1901, the links they had with mining. Before they entered the Federal Parliament, they knew a lot about mining, so many of them. I wasn't sure about Edmund Barton, our first Prime Minister, a Sydney barrister, but I realised later that his brother-in-law was the financial editor of The Age, and there was, if you were a financial editor in those days, mining was all important. His nephew was W.S. Robinson, one of the great Australian mining men. Alfred Deakin, who was the first Prime Minister to serve as Prime Minister for 3 or 4 times, Alfred Deakin, throughout his whole career as a federal member, was the member for Ballarat, very much a coal mining constituency in those days. His great rival, the leader of the Labor Party, was Andrew Fisher, who served several times as Prime Minister. He was a coal miner who migrated from Scotland to Queensland in the 1880s and settled at Gympie, and then became an engine driver and a part owner of the local newspaper, very much a gold mining man. And he was elected as the representative for that district in the first federal parliament. And soon he was the Prime Minister. And Joseph Cook, who was the Prime Minister just before the First World War, came out from the Staffordshire coalfields and worked at Lithgow as a coal weigher before he became the leader of the first parliamentary Labor Party in New South Wales. He changed his opinions and by 1913 was the Liberal Prime Minister of Australia. And even Billy Hughes, who I thought wartime Prime Minister and Prime Minister for 8 years, can't have had much connection with mining, but Billy Hughes was the leader of the wharf labourers in Sydney and then the founder of the Waterside Federation of Australia. And in those days, I think the biggest single commodity carried on the wharves of New South Wales was coal, black coal. When he was Prime Minister and was in danger of losing his seat in Sydney, he thought he would come to Victoria, still Prime Minister, and find a safer seat. He went to the great gold mining city of Bendigo and became their member. Stanley Melbourne Bruce, the next Prime Minister, coming from the famous Flinders Lane firm of Patterson, Lang and Bruce, his father founded the firm. He came here in 1858. He made his fortune selling soft goods to the goldfields. The next Prime Minister, unfortunately coming aboard during the Depression, was Scullin. Scullin was a Ballarat boy, born between the goldfields of Ballarat and Beaufort, went to school in a little school between the goldfields of Ballarat and Creswick. A Ballarat man, the editor of the evening newspaper at Ballarat, fancy Ballarat having an evening newspaper, and then entered Parliament and became Prime Minister. And then there was Joseph Lyons from Tasmania. His electorate had mining fields in it, and he was followed by Robert Menzies in 1939. Sir Robert Menzies, as many of you will remember, was so urban, so urbane, and sometimes so patrician that certainly he wouldn't have mining connections. But of course he did. His grandfather, Mr. Sampson, was one of the founders of the Amalgamated Miners Association, the first big gold trade union in Australia. He was the ally of W.G. Spence, the greatest trade unionist in our history. When Robert Menzies was a young boy, he spent much time with his trade unionist grandfather and learnt a lot of politics from him. And of course, although Mr. Menzies was a Jeparat boy from the Wimmera, his father came from Ballarat, and he went to school, to 2 schools, Humphrey Street and Grenville College, in Ballarat, when Ballarat was a great gold mining city. And who succeeded Mr. Menzies in 1941? John Curtin, the Labor Prime Minister. Where was he born? He was born in Creswick, the same town as Mr. Menzies' grandfather came from. When he went to Western Australia, which he represented in the Federal Parliament, he became one of the great supporters of the gold mining industry, and the tax-free status that was given to gold mining during the World Depression was partly due to his advocacy. And who succeeded John Curtin? Ben Chifley. Where did Ben Chifley come from? He came from Bathurst, the district that was the home of gold mining in Australia. He died, or he was defeated in 1949, and Mr Menzies came back to power and was in office from 49 to 66. That virtually ended the long period where every Prime Minister, or nearly every Prime Minister, who came to office knew something about mining and could debate it. And even if he disagreed with other people, he knew the industry that he had to legislate about. It's a remarkable record, isn't it? And of course, future Prime Ministers are not very likely to have strong mining connections. I'm not sure about Mr Hawke, I haven't found out, but I'm pretty sure his family had strong mining connections. Hawke is a Cornish name. He came from South Australia. The ethnic group in Australia in the 19th century that contributed more to mining per family than any other were the Cornish, and South Australia was their home. I'm sure he must have mining connections. So it's remarkable, isn't it, that over this long period in this country, this industry had such a pervasive influence and was so well known. I hesitate to say this, but all the debate when the mining tax came in, it was quite clear that that kind of legislation would not have been drafted by one of the Prime Ministers who had an intimate knowledge of coalfields or goldfields. I say that as a neutral observer. And one should say something about the discoverers. It's a pity, but it's bound to happen. The discoverers of major mining fields in Australia were heroes. Some of them, of course, their names were not known. Sometimes there are 4 or 5 discoverers, and you can't really have 4 or 5 heroes. But those who discovered major mining fields had a status in Australia, in their own colony or state, and in the town or the city they founded, that's really quite remarkable. Charles Raspe, the discoverer in 1883 of Broken Hill, Charles Raspe, deservedly, is still famous in Broken Hill. Paddy Hannon, who in 1893 discovered Kalgoorlie, and that was a remarkable discovery. Usually you're early on a field when you make the major discovery. A rush set in from Coolgardie to Kalgoorlie, and Paddy Hannon was one of the late people, but somehow Paddy hadn't found the first payable gold at Kalgoorlie. People were so proud of him that he'd founded a place that became before long the 9th or the 10th biggest city in Australia, and they named the main street Hannon Street, and they erected a statue by the post office in honour of him, one of the first towns in Australia, medium-sized towns, to have a statue in the main street. People admired Paddy Hannon. They might not have met him, but they realised how he'd changed their lives and changed Western Australia. When I was a student at the university, I lived in a college opposite the Melbourne General Cemetery in Carlton. Occasionally I used to walk in the cemetery looking for historical graves. People would come up to you and say, "Do you know where so-and-so's buried?" In the late 1940s, the name that people sought more than any was Paddy Hannon. They said, "Where's Paddy Hannon buried?" And sometimes you'd say, "Where are you from?" And of course, they came from Western Australia. Mount Isa was discovered by Campbell Miles. I was fortunate enough to know him very well. I was with him when he died, and he discovered Mount Isa in 1923 at a time when discoveries were few in Australia. He had been a miner at Broken Hill, but he mostly worked with horses. But he was interested in mining, and one time at Broken Hill, about 1908, the news came through that there was a new gold rush near the Gulf of Carpentaria. He thought, "I'll join it," and he and his mate set out on bicycles to ride from Broken Hill to the Gulf of Carpentaria. There were thorns along the road and the tyres were still punctured. They completed the journey with their tyres filled with dry grass. He was crossing Australia with horses in 1923 from the Pacific coast to the Northern Territory. He'd heard of a gold find in the Northern Territory which he would like to visit. He came through the Clonaclarry field, then a great copper field, but in grave trouble because the First World War had ended and copper prices had slumped. And he came towards Mount Isa. There was nothing at Mount Isa then, but a road did pass through. He had his pack horses and his riding horse. He used to set out almost before daybreak and travel with the cool of the day until about 10 in the morning, when the heat became more intense, and he would camp for the day. He said one of his horses smelt water and ran to a little water hole, and he went down with the other horses, and it was shade and water, so they camped there for the day. He always looked at the country with his farrier's hammer, his horseshoe hammer, and he went over the country and found mineral that was too heavy. It shouldn't be as heavy as that. It was heavy, of course, because it was well mineralised. It was silver lead, and that was the beginning of Mount Isa. I think very highly of him. I think highly of most of these discoverers. We often say it's luck, and of course you have to be in the right place at the right time, but that's not enough. We've all been in the right place at the right time, somewhere or other, and nothing has come of it. These were people who were observers. Every great prospector was an observer. He had powers of observation. Every great prospector was curious, wondered what it was and was willing to spend time looking at it. Campbell Miles left Mount Isa a year or two after it was discovered. He had a mate called Bill Simpson. Simpson they called Captain Kettle because of his beard. Simpson sold his shares in Mount Isa and caught a taxi from Mount Isa to Brisbane. In those days, what a journey, what an expense. He was killed in a traffic accident as soon as he arrived in Brisbane. Campbell Miles was more cautious. He used to show me the ticket he had. He caught the first train that ever went from Townsville to Melbourne. In those days, there were gaps on the Queensland rail link, and he settled in Melbourne. He never went back to Mount Isa. George Fisher, who was then the head of Mount Isa and living there, said, when I write a history of Mount Isa mines, which I was very pleased to begin, and he said, see if you can find Campbell Miles. He was living down in Melbourne. I wrote to George Fisher, said he's living in Melbourne, he's in good form, hasn't any money, but lives a frugal and a contented life. He had very strong views on food. He lived on raisin bread and sheep shanks. He didn't believe in fruit. He said fruit harmed your health. But he lived to an old age in good health. I found him and I said, the Mount Isa people would like you to return and see the place you've discovered. It's now a big town and coming towards the city. He said, I'd love to go back. He said, I'd love to drive there. He showed me his car or his truck. It was very old. I said to George Fisher by mail, I said, if you buy him a new truck, he'll come. George said, no trouble. I went to the car dealer, the new car dealer, and he said he would pay a very small sum for the old car and gave him a new car. He and his brother drove to Mount Isa. It took them ages. He went there. It was a wonderful experience. Wherever he went, people shook his hand, invited him in for a meal or a cup of tea, wanted his autograph, showed him a mineral specimen that they thought might be rich. It was so moving. There's nothing quite like it in Australia. You can't do that in a big city, can you? The discoverer is gone and you don't know who he is. You can't really do it in a country town because many people have started it. I had a great experience in, I think, 1962. He said he would like to see Mount Isa again before he died. And I wrote to Mr. Fisher, well, I called him Mr. Fisher, and said he would like to come. And George Fisher said, well, buy him an air ticket. But I had to explain to George that he didn't believe in aeroplanes. So I took him up to Mount Isa by train, 5 days from Melbourne. What a wonderful time we had. And when he reached Mount Isa, I could see the veneration in which he was held by people who'd started a new life in Mount Isa and being a rich town had begun to do well. How grateful they were to him. You can't have that these days. The great discoveries like Olympic Dam are made by a number of people, and they need a company that has faith in them and willing to spend a lot of money. You can't have the old-time hero. the old-time mining hero the public liked. They believed somehow it could be them, that they could be on the spot and make the discovery. That's understandably has changed. There was another interesting thing about mining in the early generations. Mining was totally Australian-owned. We have large numbers of international companies now in Australia, and the mining industry would be nowhere near as large without those international companies. The public still is more favourably inclined towards an Australian company than an international company. I suppose it's understandable. In the 19th century, all the money that was put into mining was local, with a few exceptions. There was a big mine at Clunes near Ballarat called the Port Phillip Company, which was English-owned. But the money was put in by Australians, and if there were dividends, the money went to Australians. So places like Ballarat and Bendigo had big stock exchanges, and during mining booms in the 1860s and 1870s, the Bendigo and the Ballarat stock exchanges were way ahead of the Sydney Stock Exchange in volume of business. And people who made their money in Bendigo and Ballarat, they often stayed there. They liked the climate, they liked the people, and they put money into town. Those of you who haven't been to Ballarat, go down Sturt Street, the main street, and see statue after statue. It's the best collection of statuary in Australia. No capital city such an avenue as Sturt Street. These were largely people who thought, this is our place, we should honour our past heroes. Charters Towers had a great stock exchange. Charters Towers is interesting. It's west of Townsville, and some of you have been there. Charters Towers was the first mining field in Australia which began to depend heavily on overseas capital. In the mid-1880s, Charters Towers, going deeper, realised that it needed speculative capital, and it came from England. And thereafter, more and more overseas capital came to Australian mining to the benefit of mining fields. Broken Hill, eventually, most of the shares in the mines, although most of the companies were Australian-owned, most of the shares in the mines were owned in England. The boards were in Australia, but by 1908, most of the shares were owned in England. When Kalgoorlie opened up in the 1890s, Kalgoorlie depended, except for a little capital from Adelaide, overwhelmingly on London capital. The first great period in Kalgoorlie's history was not based on the gold that was being mined at Kalgoorlie, it was based on the London money that was pouring in. There was a large section of the London Stock Exchange devoted entirely to dealing in Kalgoorlie shares. And now, of course, it's inevitable, mining has to have a large component of overseas capital. There's another advantage that the Australian-owned companies had in that period. They took up opportunities that might otherwise not be taken. I think Broken Hill Proprietary is one of the great stories in Australian history, not only in mining and business history, but in the general history of Australia. The men who got hold of Broken Hill when the field was new and it was producing virtually no silver lead were sheep men. They were men from the Riverina in western New South Wales. They'd bought the early shares in Broken Hill for token sums, and here they had a mine which they realised might be very rich. They didn't know about mining. What should they do? They made one of the great decisions in Australian history. They decided that they would go to the heartland in the world of the silver-lead industry, to the United States, to Colorado and Nevada, and they would buy the best man you could buy. And they brought back to Broken Hill the general manager of the great silver mine, Comstock, Virginia Consolidated, and they put him in charge at Broken Hill. I don't know what he thought of the deal when he reached Broken Hill. It was such a simple, dusty town, but there he was. From the start, Broken Hill, and BHP especially, tried the latest technology. They were also willing to experiment. It's in Broken Hill that one of the great Australian inventions, the flotation process, was largely developed between 1900 and 1914. It's interesting how in Australia the inventiveness of the mining industry is not widely known. I would suspect that's one of the 4 great inventions in the history of metallurgy, the flotation process, used throughout the world, but you don't read about it in Australia, and I would be interested to know if there's even been a flotation process on a postage stamp. Anybody these days can be on a postage stamp. BHP, when their mine was moving into low-grade ore, by about 1910 decided that their future was no longer in silver-lead mining. They realised perhaps they would go into steel. They brought from Philadelphia an expert, David Baker, and he advised them to build the steelworks in Newcastle and take the iron ore from Whyalla to Newcastle. Previously, the Whyallah's iron ore had been used as flux in the smelters at Port Pirie, owned then by BHP. It's remarkable, isn't it, how much of Australian industrial development came from BHP's steelworks. So many new industries came to Australia. BHP, by the 1930s, was the leader in so many activities outside mining. It was the biggest ship owner in Australia. It became eventually the biggest shipbuilder in Australia. And at Whyalla it's remarkable to think that ships of 75,000 tonnes were built in the BHP shipyard at Whyalla. So many of Australia's preparations for war, the Second World War, were done by BHP. It set up the manufacture of military aircraft at Fisherman's Bend, only 2 miles from here. BHP formed the company with the assistance of other mining companies, especially Broken Hill Associated Smelters. They made in 1939 the first military aircraft in Australia. We mass-produced military aircraft before we mass-produced the Holden car. They were slightly too late. The Wirraway was too ineffective compared to the wonderful Japanese Zero planes, but by 1942, Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation and Fisherman's Bend were making first-class military aircraft and fighting in the Pacific. It's a remarkable story, isn't it, what one company can do if it believes that you must buy the best talent. And of course, in the 1960s, one of the great events in Australian economic history, the discovery of oil and gas in Bass Strait took place through Broken Hill, teaming up with the United States company Esso. I sometimes say that that was an event of incredible importance. The difference between New Zealand and Australia, and New Zealand for long had a higher standard of living than Australia, was that New Zealand had no oil. Australia, on the other hand, when the great oil crisis developed in the Western world in the early 1970s, had this large oil and gas field on Bass Strait that made us all self-sufficient. But that's another story. So there have been so many achievements in the mining industry in Australia. There have been many disadvantages. I think it's fair to say that the mining industry in the 19th century often had poor industrial relations. The industrial relations became worse in the 20th century. My view is that you only have poor industrial relations if both sides have got something to contribute to it, even though one side may have contributed more than the other to the bad industrial relations. Broken Hill had stormy industrial relations for a very long period. They had a strike of enormous length after the First World War. They called it the spud and onion days because people had to eat so simply. As a result of the strike, the Broken Hill miners got the 32.5-hour week at a time when the 48-hour week or more was normal in Australia. It became a paradise in a way for the working miner. But coal mining always had a stormy industrial history in Australia. And in the First World War, when so many Australians were dying in France, the country at home was almost crippled by the long strikes in the coal mines in New South Wales, in the railways that used the black coal, and on the waterfront that carried the black coal. We forget that the industrial relations on the coalfields of Australia were so poor in the Second World War that a couple of weeks before France fell, one of the traumatic events of the Second World War, and in many ways a turning point, when France was about to fall, Australia was dislocated because there was a massive coal strike on the New South Wales coalfields. At that time, Victoria and South Australia depended so heavily on coal shipped from New South Wales. When coal didn't reach Victoria, of course, gas was rationed. The railways, the country railways, couldn't run their trains. We forget that the Snowy scheme, which was one of the triumphs of Australia in the 1950s and the 1960s, the Snowy scheme was in part an attempt to reduce Australia's dependence on a black coal mining industry where industrial relations were so turbulent and the delivery of coal was so poor. And it's fair to say that the accident rate in the mining fields was high. This is one of the astonishing changes of the last 50 years, the reduction in the accident rate on so many mining fields. Of course, there are improvements still to make, but many people in many mines can feel proud that their accident rate has improved so much. We know, many of you will know what it was like in earlier periods. The great disasters in Australian mining took place between 1880 and 1920 or 1921. 1882, the West Gold mining disaster was at Creswick near Ballarat. The mine flooded through a miscalculation by the mine manager, and 22 men were drowned. There was in 1887 at Bulli, more than 80 men were killed in a mine explosion. At Mount Kembla in 1902, 96 men were killed in a mining explosion. At Mount Lyell in 1912, 42 men died as a result of a fire at the mine. At Mount Mulligan in far north Queensland, it's funny to think of a coal mine in far north Queensland even in those days. At Mount Mulligan in 1921 there was an explosion heard, they say, 30 kilometres away, and 75 men lost their lives. We've had nothing like those disasters since. It's worth commenting that the mines in the period between 1880 and 1920 became renowned, not only in Australia, but also overseas for episodes of bravery. The institution that awarded bravery medals in Australia in those days was the Royal Humane Society. And between about 1885 and 1920, the Clark Gold Medal was the award given not every year to an act of extreme bravery. I think half the times that gold medal was awarded, it went to people on the mining fields in Western Australia, Tasmania, Broken Hill and Queensland, who did acts of remarkable bravery. We're celebrating this year the 100th anniversary of Gallipoli. Gallipoli was noted for its bravery. Of course, there are instances of non-bravery there, and we don't read about it, instances of desertion and so forth, but the conspicuous bravery at Gallipoli and on the Western Front doesn't come from nowhere. The bravery is there before the war begins. The bravery is more likely to arrive in a civilian society which prizes heroism and self-sacrifice and tries as best it can to reward it. I think we should see the First War in Gallipoli as a continuation of something that was there much earlier, and so often the mining fields were the home of it. I must conclude. So mining has had a remarkable history in this land. The mining industry is in a period of great strength, and there's no doubt that it will remain powerful for a very long time to come. My understanding is that the obstacle that, or the criticism that's directed more than any other criticism against mining is on environmental matters. They're very difficult issues, and it's without doubt that mining was careless in environmental matters before the Second World War, as was every industry in Australia. Then in the 1960s, there came a new awareness that more should be done to protect the environment. We forget, however, that neglectful as the mining industry so often was before the Second World War, there's a strong case for saying that the heart of the green movement in Australia in the 1930s was not in Hobart or Sydney or Broken Hill. In Broken Hill in the late 1930s, when the dust storms for the interior were so strong, great layers of dust fell on Broken Hill, and the mines were eventually surrounded by a little desert. And a small group of Broken Hill people, led by the Barrier Field Naturalist Club, decided that something could be done. And they fenced off large areas, especially in the Zinc Corporation in New Broken Hill, with the full support of the management of those companies, and planted native trees and began to transform the environment at Broken Hill. That was the great event, I suppose, in the conservation movement in the 1930s, and it came in a town which is often sneered at for its lack of interest in environmental matters. Let me conclude. All honour to your industry. You've had great successes. I hope the success continues. Good luck.